I got really lucky and I met Deborah Mayhew, and I think of her as being like the fairy godmother of UX. She wrote a really great book called The User Experience Design Lifecycle. And I got to work with her on a project with Cisco Systems many, many years ago. And she highlighted for me what we now consider to be like just standard UX wasn't a thing back then. And so this old idea of user-centered design, interviewing people, doing needs analysis, going through the process of creating personas and scenarios and use cases, and then creating wireframes from those kinds of things and testing them with users. All that didn't exist back when I started. And so got to meet her. She really helped me refine my process while we were working on that project together. And long story short, it's been a long run. I've gotten to be really lucky enough to work with some really big name companies like Google and Samsung, Rolex, Michael Kors, MIT, those guys. And then a million companies you've never heard of before, lots of startups. And it's in general been a really fun and rewarding career. So for those of you who are new, I can't imagine a career that is better to be stepping into right now, and one that will keep you definitely on your toes and definitely learning through your whole career. Like I said, I've been doing this for 25 years now, and I learn every day. There's no user experience testing session that I sit in that I don't learn something from. I meet colleagues that are just brand new starting out, and I learn things from them. And of course, I meet a lot of people who are super seasoned, and I learn from them as well. So my goal with the book that I wrote, and with the courses that I teach, and with these types of speaking engagements, is to try to pay back as much as I can, and just get take all that experience that I've got and try to share it so that hopefully if it resonates with you guys, you'll be able to save some time on your side and maybe even do some work that's a little bit better. So this is the book that I've most recently written. It's called From Chaos to Concept. You can buy it on Amazon. Wiley's my publisher. And I'm not just on my website right now to promote myself. I'm here because this link up top has the artifact downloads from today's talk. So you don't have to buy the book or anything. If you go to the site and you click on this link, it'll bring you down to the bottom. And these are some of the artifacts that we're going to cover today. What I will say, though, is that my work and my artifacts and my process is a never-ending evolution of process, right? So I also have files up on Figma. Hopefully you guys can see my Figma screen that I'm sharing right now. This is, if you go to Figma's community site, I'm Kevin Braun there, or you can just look me up as Lightbender. That's my username. And I just have a couple different artifacts up here that I've built out so far. But this one right here in particular is the one that I want you guys to see. It's the goals and strategies and objectives document. The reason why I want you guys to see this is that the one I'm going to show you today while I'm working and kind of giving you an example is just an Excel spreadsheet. And that works fine in most cases, and works well if you already had a workshop with someone and you had whiteboards where you wrote everything down and then you're just capturing what you covered in the workshop. But since COVID started, the whole need for everybody to be able to work as teams remotely has become a lot more important. So I've started creating the artifacts that I have in Figma because Figma is such an amazing tool for working remotely as teams. And so basically you can just pop this open, download it, and then start working in it. So anyway, I just wanted to share that part with you guys first so that, if anybody has to drop early, you know that you can at least get a hold of some of these artifacts and move on from there. All right, so now I'm going to switch out from sharing this to the PowerPoint presentation so we can get into what we're actually supposed to be talking about today. All right, so hopefully you guys see a deck that says the path to Vaporware. That is the deck that I'm hoping is showing because that's what I'm actually talking about.
We're seeing it.
Awesome, cool. All right, so I've put together a little story that should only take like 5 minutes to go through. And this story kind of makes fun of everybody in our industry. So if you're in any particular skill set and I'm making fun of you, just know that if you wait one more slide, I'm probably going to be making fun of the other skill sets as well. Try not to be offended anybody. This really is in good fun. It's a way of me trying to say over the past 25 years, what I've seen really go wrong, all encapsulated into kind of one story to set up how we might avoid that as teams. Okay, so if you're not familiar with what Vaporware is, Vaporware just means software that gets specified, and maybe fake screens get made and sold at a trade show where you show people and say, this is our upcoming new cool functionality. And then that functionality never ever actually becomes real. And of course, people are buying your software and hoping that these things are going to become real, but they don't. So it's vaporware because it vanishes eventually, right? And so that's one of the symptoms of the problems that I'm about to outline. All right. Okay, so most of us have been there. It's trade show season, and nothing else matters but getting something together that will help the sales team demonstrate enough new value in your product to justify the cost increases that the board of directors is trying to cram down everyone's throat. That is the quick setup. Everyone is in a tough position at this point, right? So the product people, they know that they're the ones who are supposed to find this new value and articulate it in terms of a plan that can be executed on in an overly aggressive time frame. It doesn't take too long for the product team to start to think differently and eventually come up with some ideas that sound really great in the echo chamber. But in reality, those ideas normally would take like 5 years to develop if that was actually the right thing to be developing in the first place. Sorry, I got to switch screens here as I do this. All right. And then you have the designers. They know that they're rushing the process. It's trade show season. Everybody's throwing ideas into this, process and trying to keep things moving. So they know they're rushing the process and that everything they're doing is based on assumptions from the C-level people and from the product team, instead of being vetted with user testing and market analysis, because those things would take too long in this context. They also have a sneaking suspicion that the elaborate screens that they're working on with their teammates and creating into a demo, they think that functionality is probably going to be almost impossible for the dev team to build. That said, they have the power of Figma and Sketch and InVision to make all those shitty ideas look really, really great. And then you have the dev team. They've been through this a million times, right? So they've lived this cycle a million times and it barely even phases them at this point in time. They're about to be handed a flaming bag of dog shit, and they're wedged firmly between an ambiguous design spec and a rock solid trade show deadline. The dev team pulls everything together in an entirely rigged demo, full of holes and fake data, with the promise from the leadership team that after the trade show, we'll make some sort of, huge effort to do this right, to refactor, and in general, create a super viable product. And of course, the customer is standing there at the trade show with the sales guy who's, pushing the features that are probably never actually going to become real. So, that's the big problem. And, if you're feeling that way, then you're not alone, right? So the IEEE Spectrum report on why software projects fail, which is a really great report if you haven't read it or are unaware of it. It would be something I would highly recommend looking up because it covers in detail an awful lot of good things that you can avoid as you're trying to build out software products. Anyway, one of the core things that they talk about in that report is the idea that unrealistic or unarticulated project goals, those are identified as some of the top contributors to why these projects fail. The Strategic Agility Project from MIT Sloan, again, another great report that I highly recommend, states that only 1/4 of managers surveyed could list 3 of the company's 5 strategic priorities, and even worse, 1/3 of the leaders that were in charge of implementing the company's strategy, they couldn't even list one, right? So I've seen this in my career personally, and I'm always floored by it because, oftentimes, right now I'm a full-time employee for a company, but a lot of times I'm a contractor. And, companies will hire me and will spend weeks going through the negotiation process, trying to figure out, what my rate is going to be and how that's going to play out and all those kinds of things. And I'm not super cheap, right? I'm a pretty expensive resource. So when all that work is done and I go sit down at the first kickoff meeting, and the first thing, that comes up for me is like, how are we going to measure success, right? Like, what are we doing here? And how are we going to know we did it right? That's my first question. That's what I want to know. And when people can't answer that question, I think, well, like, how did you know spending money on me was going to be a good idea then? Like, how do you even know what we're trying to drive towards, right? And so anyway, these points from these really high profile reports kind of backs up the fact that I didn't only just get unlucky and run into this problem. This problem's happening pretty pervasively throughout throughout the industry. So my guess is that some of you have probably run into these types of situations. And if so, well, hopefully the rest of this presentation will help you avoid it. All right. So what I think the best cure that I've found is for teams to work together to establish goals and strategies and measurable objectives that everyone will be working towards, and document them so that there's no question about what the team has agreed upon, right? And what it is that you're doing. When that is done, I think of it as the Constitution, right? And that Constitution serves to guide and protect the teams that I'm managing or working with. So that, like, when someone jumps into the middle of a sprint saying that this new whiz bang feature needs to be added in ASAP because they've got customer or some big customer told them that it should be done, the team can point back to this goals, strategies, and objectives document as their Constitution and just simply ask, like, what measurable objective from our agreement is this new idea going to make an impact on? And if their idea, this new idea, is a direct link to one of the objectives, and the team believes this new request might actually be more valuable in achieving the goals that they've set, well, then maybe that's worth working on. Like, maybe that's worth taking the team and sitting down and kind of reevaluating, creating an amendment, as one might say, to their Constitution, right? But if it doesn't actually point to any of the objectives that the team has identified and is currently working on, well, that doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It just means that the team could consider at that point just putting it into the backlog or the icebox and just saying, like, listen, we're going to come back to this at some other point, but right now we're working on things that everybody is associated with being meaningful to our business, right? And so that's the high level 50,000 foot view of what I would say we would want to do. And so I'm going to give you a quick example of where this process comes from and where this has been done in the past, right? So if you know anything about World War II or any of that history, that's great. If you don't worry too much about it. It's not critical for this to make sense. But in World War II, there might have been a big goal to win the war in Europe, right? Now, there was another war in the Pacific, and that one has its own set of strategies and objectives. But for this conversation, we're just going to talk about Europe, right? So we're going to say the goal was to win the war in Europe. So that's our goal for our goal, strategies, and objectives document. And then each goal can have multiple strategies, right? And so here I've listed 3 potential strategies for winning the war, right? One is using your Navy, right? The other is an amphibious attack, and another one is an airborne attack. So if I take that first strategy and I say, well, what would be an objective? Like, what would be a measurable objective we could come up with for this strategy? Again, usually there's multiple objectives and there are multiple measurable objectives for each strategy. But in this case, I've just listed this one, right? So a measurable objective would be, destroying the fortifications along the shore. That's the objective for the Navy. And if they meet that objective, along with a couple others, this strategy will have been considered executed on. Whether or not it's successful or not will be determined as to whether or not we meet our goal. But you can at least say that you have executed on your objectives because they were measurable, and you either did or you did not destroy the fortifications along the shore. And if you did all of the objectives underneath your strategy, then you've executed on that strategy. Again, might be a bad strategy, might be a good one, but at least you did it. Again, the amphibious attack, a measurable objective for that could be capturing specific beaches to establish beachheads for the rest of the invasion force. And for the airborne, a measurable objective could be cutting off the supply and the retreat routes for the enemy fortifications that are defending the coast, right? So without much more explanation, that whole process should be pretty straightforward, right? Obviously, these techniques get used in life or death situations throughout the world all the time with our military. And I'm not saying we need to follow everything exactly how they do it, but I do like this framework, and I've definitely seen it work out more often than not. So I wanted to share it with you guys. So one important note that sometimes comes up in this conversation is the idea that your objectives under a strategy can become another team's goals, right? So if you picture that the generals, the 4-star generals who come up with this high-level plan with the goal of winning the war in Europe, they create these strategies as a way of executing on that, and they move the teams through their process here. Well, when they talk to the actual airborne divisions who are going to be, dropping out of planes with their parachutes, those teams don't need to understand every aspect of this war plan, right? What those teams need to do is focus on the specific part they're responsible for. And so in this case, we'll just say that, a high level objective, could be to take a 5-mile section of beach that was named Omaha. And it was an objective for the US command, right? That was the high level, but it was the goal for the infantry division. So the infantry division commanders had to then take that goal for them and break it down into strategies and objectives, right? And so just wanted to make sure it's clear that this is a little bit of a Russian nesting doll kind of framework that allows you to take incredibly complex problem sets and break them down into chunks that you can then pass down through the chain so that people can do meaningful work without having to understand the entire big picture of everything. So at a really high level, that covers how it works. Now, you should be thinking to yourself, well, how does this actually apply to UX, right? So we're going to jump back to that problem statement that I was talking about before, where you've got people with the trade show promises trying to break into your plan and what that does to your team. This is just a little illustration of the work that your team's doing on the right-hand side is already disorganized and not super well executed on, right? But it gets far worse when the trade show team comes back from there and the sales team starts talking to everybody and trying to inject all the junk that's on the left-hand side into the stuff that you already have some pretty good chaos going on. And so this just is a quick highlight of what the problem looks like. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how that framework now can come into play, right? So if we have a high-level goal, right, and instead of being war this time, we're going to talk about like an e-commerce website. And I'm just going to say for an e-commerce website, one of their goals might be increasing their average order values, right? The highest level of that goal is going to be just trying to bring in more revenue. I'm going to focus it a little bit and say, we want to increase our average order value, right? So if we move down the rung there and we look at strategies, what are some possible strategies for that? Well, one possible strategy is we could just increase prices. As people who also buy things, you probably know that if you just randomly increase the price, you're probably going to drive down the number of sales, right? So you may actually achieve your goal of driving up your average order value, but you'll be doing that at the cost of driving down your overall sales and potentially your overall revenue, right? So it's important when looking at these and considering a strategy that might be helpful and viable, like what its negative impact might be on the actual goal, right? And so in this particular case, I've bolded the sell more bundled products because that's a strategy that might actually work, right? You're not raising the price, you're just bundling products together. And if you can convince people to buy more products together, then your average order value is going to go up. And maybe that would actually work, right? So that's just one strategy. And then if you move down from there and we look at some measurable objectives for that strategy, one is to drive more users to the bundled product detail pages. That's measurable, right? That is super easy to measure. You can look at your analytics and know how many people are visiting those bundle pages. And another possibility is to design a flow that reduces the time on task or the clicks to complete for that task of adding a bundle to your cart, items to your cart, right? And so these are just different approaches again. In this particular case, I've bolded the design a flow that reduces time on task because that's the one we're going to look at. But from there, if you just imagine then that you move on to tactical work, right? So the whole process goes from goals to strategies to measurable objectives, and then the measurable objectives get broken down into tactical work, okay? And this tactical work is what most people think of when they're talking about like the UX activities that we do all day long, right? So, oh, what are you doing today? Well, I'm creating some wireframes to create a storyboard for this thing. Well, that's a tactical activity that is hopefully backed up by some measurable objectives and a higher level strategy, right? Not always though. And so I would say right now, as you think about your own work, the work that you're doing, do you know how the success for the work that you're doing right now is going to be measured? If you're creating a new UI, do you know how that's going to potentially impact your higher level business? And if the answer is no, that's not a catastrophe. It just means maybe you can go back and ask some of these questions to try to identify what the answers are. And if the answers aren't readily available, then maybe you can start to look at this process and think about how you could potentially incorporate it at your work so that these answers are more readily available and everybody on the team is aware of them. Because the more people who are aware of these things, the better your conversations are going to be, right? So when I pointed out that increasing prices might actually improve my average order value, but bring down my overall revenue, that's not something that might be obvious to everybody, right? But if everybody's aware of what you're actually trying to do, then the developers can have a bright and happy conversation. The QA people can have a bright and happy conversation. The marketers can bring in feedback, and all of those people, like, they're engaged in a much more focused and directed way. And when you have disagreements in this process, it's a lot easier to just go back and say, well, look, I think here's my reason for saying that I think your idea might not be the best one right now. And it's because I think it would impact, X, Y, or Z negatively. And since we as a team have identified that, I would think we might not want to do that right now. That's not combative. That's not insulting someone and saying, I think you're stupid. That's just pointing out how something might not actually fit into the current plan. And so part of my goal here is to hopefully get the whole team involved and be able to leverage the value of the whole team while making it so the team can respect each other and work together and disagree peacefully, right? So anyway, long story short, this is the high level framework of how it works. And so from there, I'm going to dive into sharing some of the artifacts that I use so that we can kind of see how I do it and talk through it a little bit. So I got to unfortunately get out of PowerPoint and share. So just give me 1 second while I switch. All right. So if you've bought into the idea that, you might be interested in doing this type of thing, hopefully you guys are seeing my new workshop agenda spreadsheet here. But if you've bought into that idea, you might be thinking, how on earth do you do this? Like, how is it possible that you get this goals, strategies, and objectives document done? And I'm not going to tell you there's only one right way to do it, but I know that when I start working with startups or companies that don't have a lot of this really well defined, I like to run a workshop, and that workshop can run anywhere from 1 to 3 days. It just depends on how complex the business is. And basically, I send out an agenda in advance that includes this 3-day, it depends on how many days you're going to run it, but 3-day workshop. And the whole goal of this workshop is to first get an understanding of the business. Second, have the team talk about the whole goal-driven design process, right? What I just kind of described to you. And then dig into, like, what are the company goals, right? So high-level business goals for this product. For this project, sales positioning, how does the team sell this? The organization, sales, marketing, product, design, engineering, all that. How are they all working together right now? And then what are the current success metrics? How are people currently, measuring that? And then from there, moving on to, reviewing any research that you have that currently talks about, like, what's going on in the market and what's going on within your space. And then if you've done usability analysis of the current work that you have, let's talk about that, get all that going along. And in general, I'm not going to go through too much of this, but the idea is that you have a workshop where you kind of bring everything to the table, like the current knowledge of the situation to the table, so that as you kind of work through, you can start to identify strategies here. And then on day 2, start looking through, making sure you follow up on that. And then once you have all your strategies, move into objective definition. Normally when I'm doing this in person, it's on a whiteboard. And then from those objectives, this is, again, one of those points where this strategic process matches with the tactical process that everybody thinks of as kind of being like the UX activities. From those objectives, you can start to identify who your personas might be. Okay. And so I'm going to jump out of this process here. Just assume that you guys kind of got this. This is up on my website, so you can grab this artifact if you want. Again, I would expect if you did, you just kind of change it to meet your needs, but it kind of covers a high level example. All right. So then from there, if you have a goals and strategies and objectives document, this is one way that it could look. Like I said, so this is increasing TAM, which is total addressable market. So that's the high level goal for this business. I've only included one strategy here just to show, like, this is my single strategy, but you can scroll down. And once you get to the next color, you add another strategy here, and then all of its objectives would be below. These are all of the objectives that I have listed for this strategy. And it's important to note that like I want all of these to be measurable, but that doesn't mean I'm going to capture them as being measurable from the team. When we're brainstorming and we're trying to just capture everything, I might just write down whatever the idea is, and then we'll have to come back and think about like, well, how would we measure that? Like if distinct job descriptions that are clearly defined is one of the things that we believe is going to support this strategy, right? Then how are we going to know we're done with this? So the team might have to come back and say, okay, well, if we have 50% of our job descriptions end up being clearly defined, and clearly defined is categorized by these 3 qualities, well then great, you got there. But just know that you're probably not going to run a workshop that captures all of the essential information in one shot. You're going to capture the high level stuff that's going to build questions for you to then reach out to the team and dig into each individual place to get the answers you need. And then just scrolling over here, I have a couple other columns. So there's prerequisites, effort, and feasibility. These also help the team kind of plan once you've started to come up with your big list. If you can start to get information in here about what is needed to do these, it'll help your team prioritize your objectives so that you can do them in an order that is going to be most advantageous to you, right? And so that's another piece that you need to take into consideration, and that you'd want to make sure you bring into the process. And we're almost done here. I'm going to just jump into this next piece, which is a weighted persona feature matrix. Once that opens up. So I didn't populate this too much, but just the idea that if you had persona 1, persona 2, persona 3, these are weighted. So you see the value for their weight here, right? And then if you have your features over here, you start listing out all your features, right? And then you can talk about what the value is. These are the values down here, right? So if it's 2, it says that the persona requires this or loves this feature. And if it's a negative 1, it's actually harming this persona. So if persona number 1 is my highest valuable, like most valuable persona to my company, my business would go out of business if I didn't have this customer, right? Then I'm probably not going to want to be doing too many things that are going to fall into the -1 category for that persona. It may be that for this one, for persona 3, I may end up doing things that hurt them, but that help this persona. And this is why it's super important to both prioritize your objectives and then prioritize your personas, so the work you're doing is both achievable and impactful, but you're also doing it for the right users, and you're promoting them the right features for the right users. Because without this, your work is going to end up just being like, well, this persona said they needed it, great, so you just do it. But who knows which level that persona is. And so if you don't have this document, it's awful hard to do that. And you end up potentially doing work that, over here, if you just did the work for persona 3 here, you might end up, hurting persona 1 or vice versa. So you just kind of want to make sure you're being purposeful about this. And this framework helps me track me being purposeful when it comes to that. And then finally, just kind of branching off into what everybody else would probably think of as being straight up UX work, is this last piece. So this is just an example. This is not what every single persona I create looks like. Many of them, in fact, are just, in Google Docs and things like that. But just a quick example of a persona that one might be able to create based off of the information that you've captured. So I would call this a proto persona, because at this point, this persona doesn't have a lot of research to back it up. This persona has a lot of C-level information from the C-level team. So the CEO, the CFO, that kind of thing have all provided a ton of information. The team has provided information, but this information needs to be vetted with testing. So at this stage, though, it's good to have some picture of what you're doing. And so, creating this at this high level to cover motivations. And then these usage scenarios describe how this one persona may end up using the system differently depending upon a specific context. So, at the beginning of his search, he might have different activities than he has later on after he's already found a new job, and now he just decides he wants to upskill, and then he's in a different place. And then after he's completed the upskilling, he has a whole different set of tasks that he might want to do. And so it's important also to kind of capture a broader picture. So I wanted to share that as well. So that kind of wraps up what I was trying to cover for today. If you guys have any questions, I would love to dig in. And if you can't think of your question now, or would prefer not to ask it now, you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn or through the Global UXD Slack channel that we're all on.
We're all part of, or will be part of. Thanks, Kevin. That was really illuminating. Yeah, and everyone, you could start typing in your questions and we'll take them. I guess I was kind of taking some notes as you were going through. I was wondering whether this sort of framework was something that was also applicable. So you talk about it in these like really large new feature ideas that people are bringing on and we're like, gotta do this. Does it also apply to those small little changes where it feels like upper management might not really understand their client or their consumer very well, and so they're always going a little like, let's make this little change, this little change, this little change. Do you feel like the same framework kind of applies to that problem as well?
Yeah. So I think it does. And I think the more disciplined we all can become about trying to find ways to measure our own success in like the work that we do, it helps to push back on some of those conversations, right? So I'm just going to pull out an example and say, for whatever reason, the CEO wants the banner bar across the top of the page to be changed to orange. And, we need to do this work now. And oh, by the way, it can't just be orange. It's going to be orange, and it has to look like fall leaves and all these other things, right? Because it's almost Halloween, and so we want to do this. So that it makes perfect sense, right? Like, so if it's Halloween or around that period of time, you hear that request, and it makes perfect sense, and it's hard to push back against things that make like logical sense at the beginning, right? So I guess in that particular case, I would be trying to point out to whoever is kind of making that request of my team normally at this point, I would be saying, okay, listen, so that effort is going to require at least one meeting for the team to sit down and kind of decide what it is we're going to do and kind of get their marching orders. It's going to require a designer to go create this thing. And it's going to require the dev team to, put it up on the servers and make sure it's there. And it's going to require the QA team to validate that we didn't break anything in the process, right? So that's just like bare minimum. That's what that's going to require, right? And so I would be saying, okay, look, that's going to take all combined. We'll just say that's like 25 hours worth of work across the team, right? And I'll be just pointing right to that. And I would say, okay, we got 25 hours. And here are the things we're currently working on that you've already identified as being our primary objectives. So you're going to take us off of our primary objectives to do this thing for you. So I just need to understand, like, what measurable benefit are we going to get from this, right? And it's not saying that you're going to win this battle every time, right? But my experience has been that the more logic and data you can bring to conversations, the harder it is for them to push back, right? And so I've definitely run into situations where if you're in a kind of toxic culture, that even when you bring data and logic, you lose because they outpower you, right? I don't know if you've ever heard of the concept of the hippo, the highest paid person in the room, but like sometimes the hippo just makes the decision regardless of all other factors, right? And so it might just be like, hey, my mom doesn't like blue, the CEO says, so orange it is, and boom, you're doing it, right? But for me anyway, I always feel better when I could at least look back and say, well, we argued against that and we made a really good case. We lost this time. Hopefully we can win again in the future. It's far better than feeling completely powerless, right? And just feeling like, whoa, we just have to do it because, I don't know. I don't even know why we wouldn't do it, and I also will say that, over time, everybody's careers kind of evolve, right? The more times you lose those logic-based arguments, just use that as a little bit of motivation to maybe look for a place where you could win some of those logic-based arguments. Because in the end of the day, we all have a very finite number of work hours within our careers. And it feels like forever, but at the end of the day, there's only so much actual impact you're going to have on the real world. And so try to focus as much of that time on doing good things for people. And if you've got people actively working against you, it's probably something to consider as you try to look for your next opportunity.
Right, definitely, yeah. So we have two open questions now. Someone asked, can you share where your Google Sheet is on your site? Can't seem to find it. So.
Oh, sure, yeah. So if it's easier, it's just chaos2concept.com, and then scroll all the way to the bottom. Or you can click on the artifacts link at the top. And I'll make sure everybody has a link. I'll put it into the, what do you call it there? I'll put it into the channel or whatever.
Cool, thank you. Yeah. Our next question after that is, how big is a project team typically before they have their first dedicated UX writer, which is tangential, but.
Before they have their first UX writer? No, that's a really great question. And it's a lot like that one falls into the category of like QA people for me too, right?
Yeah.
Like I absolutely adore working with QA people and I want them in the process from the very beginning. And most people think of them as the end of the process and don't even worry about it. Same thing with the writers. Like, so I would say, unfortunately, the reality of the current situation is that teams are probably pretty mature by the time they have their first UX writer, right? So if it's a startup or whatever, they're probably a couple years in before they have their first dedicated person. And I say a couple years, that's for the good ones, right? Oftentimes it goes much further than that because everybody thinks, well, I can speak English, I can write, this makes perfect sense to me. And then, that's what happens, right? And so unfortunately, the current state of things is that, it's much longer down the process that you get UX writers in. But it's something that I advocate all the time, just like I advocate for the QA people, because you need those people in with specific skill sets to do the job. And it always cracks me up that nobody reads online. They scan, right? They don't read all the data. They don't read the details. They scan until they find the thing they want. And then they'll read very carefully, right? And everybody knows that, and the research backs that up. And we don't invest in the people who could write the content that's super scannable and super meaningful and impactful. And we all just trust that we could do it ourselves magically, which.
Well, we always think very highly of ourselves.
Yeah, it's a complete fallacy. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, our next question. How can you tell if your goals and objectives are specific enough? I work at an e-commerce company and our metric is always measured the same way: add to cart or buy.
Yeah. So if your goal is like add to cart, like the number of people who are adding to cart, then break it down into the strategies from there. If it's as binary as that, right? Just say my goal is the add to cart, and then what objectives could what strategies could I put in place to meet that goal, right? And so it could be, like I said, lowering price, right? If you lower the price on something that's valuable, people are going to add to the cart. Not always a viable business decision. You can provide more descriptions, right? And see if do some UX research to see whether people add more then, or if they just ignore all that detail that you added. But you can go through and keep adding strategies underneath that and then measurable objectives. I don't know if that's helping or answering the question, but that's how I would typically do it. I know a lot of businesses, especially in e-commerce, they get laser focused on only a couple things. And our job is to say, okay, great. If you want to be laser focused on that, I'm going to break it down so that we have more to talk about. And it's not just one number every day.
Right. And then actually, I'll go off of that a little bit and ask whether when you're creating all these strategies, then off of this like larger goal and then breaking it down in this Matryoshka nesting doll kind of thing, how do you determine? You talked about this a little bit, but like, how do you determine maybe not which strategy to focus on, but how many? Do you only do one at a time to be really focused, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I totally know what you mean. And so that's again where hopefully you have like a little squad of people who are fully capable working with you, right? So when you're doing that prayer, after you come up with you do your divergent exercise and you identify all of the possible strategies, then you converge with your squad, right? And the way that I like to converge is with the squad. I like to look at things and say, what's the level of effort for this, right? Do we have data from other examples that show that this makes a meaningful impact, right? And just kind of walk through those things. And eventually what you're going to do is you're going to keep moving items up in your list that are less of an effort and look like a better bet from a results point of view. And those will naturally move up to the top. And then there'll be like a stratification line where you'll notice that like a whole bunch of items fell way below because they were way too much engineering effort or just too uncertain. And it's like, okay, great, maybe we don't even need to think about those now. But I don't like to start there. I like to start with the big broad set because it'd be terrible to leave something amazing on the table just because you were trying to keep it narrowed to one thing. Right. And actually, at the company right now I'm at, I noticed that we tend to a little bit laser focus, and it's something I'm trying to back us out and say, I think we need to have a divergent exercise again because we're too focused right now, I think.
That's great. And how often do you feel like you go into it's whenever it feels right?
No. It ends up like in a natural life cycle, it almost ends up feeling like it's like half a year, quarter. It depends on the chunks of the work, and it really depends on the size of the company. So when I was working at Cox Automotive, they're like a very large organization, and so this was a conversation. This type of conversation was happening like once every half year or once a year, and then we were breaking the work down and doing a ton of work to support all of it. But at startups, this stuff happens like it could happen any given Tuesday. Like we're just grooving, and then we realize, wait a minute, what we're doing isn't moving the needle. We need to go revisit this approach and see what we need to do next, and kind of iterate back that way.
Right. Okay, we got another few questions. So there are so many UX Slack channels out there. Which ones do you follow or feel are the best?
Oh my gosh, Slack channels?
Other than ours, of course, ours is
no.
ours needs a little bit of developing. So you guys chat away on our Slack channel.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are really good ones out there.
No, that's a really good question. And I have a terrible answer for it, in that almost all of my effort is focused towards LinkedIn. And that is because that's where I find like the most professional discussions kind of across the board. And my experience as a UX person is that my UX work has gotten far better the more professions I interact with, right? So like right now I'm very much working and following a lot of people in machine learning and artificial intelligence and those kinds of things. And I can't find them if I'm only looking in my own groups. And so for me right now, I've taken a step back from being focused on just like the UX groups, and I'm looking towards some other groups, and that puts me in LinkedIn more often. So I don't have any really great recommendations, unfortunately.
But I love that answer. It's definitely something we try to do as well, as reach out to people outside of the UX community, because I think that it really helps to bring out different perspectives and find solutions that way. So, yeah.
Yep. So one other thing I would say is that I'm a member of a couple private groups through Slack that are like one individual has worked with a whole bunch of people and says, I loved working with each of you. And so let's be in a channel together so that we can kind of continue to share. So I'm in a couple of those, and those relationships are super meaningful. And I end up getting, a lot of really good information from there. But that question is making me think, maybe I need to step back and look at some of this stuff a little
better. Okay, another question. Have you used a business needs or user goals matrix exercise with clients? Have you found it helpful in getting businesses to think about more than just product features?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of the core, right, of what we do all the time, or what I end up doing all the time. I would say that one of the things I try to emphasize, like when I talk to folks, is the idea that like at the end of the day, the people who are paying me and the people we're keeping the lights on at the business. So I have to have an understanding of what it is that's going to keep the business going, right? So I don't ever lose track of that. But as soon as I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of that, I immediately switch over to who their customers are, who the users are, and that's where I primarily focus, right? Because you're never going to have a business unless you have those customers. But at the same time, if you solely focus your effort on the customers and you're not paying attention to what the actual business goals are, you're not going to be doing yourself any favors there either. So it's inextricable. They have to be connected. And so I don't know if that answers the question well, but for me, you have to do them both all the time. They're directly connected. And anytime I work with a company that isn't doing user research, the first thing I tell them is they need to stop all the other things they're doing, because they have no idea where they're wasting their money. And we need to start creating, all of the artifacts and all the processes in place to understand the users from a research point of view.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great answer. We have a few more questions over here. So my startup wants me to create the same UI UX designs for our mobile web and mobile app, and my goal is to improve navigation and information architecture. How can I apply your framework to define the objectives and tactics to achieve a measurable improvement? Would I need to conduct UX research even when I believe the navigation is very poor and needs to be improved?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't always conduct UX research, especially when it comes to things that can kind of be proven out through like heuristics, right? So the Nielsen norming group and about 50 billion other people have already proved out a whole bunch of different things that we don't need to go do that research again for, right? So I would say a good approach to that might be doing a heuristics evaluation. If you've been doing it for a long period of time, you can kind of like do an expert review, which is kind of like a heuristic evaluation light, right? But if you're at all new, or if you're feeling like people won't believe what you're saying, just literally do a heuristics evaluation. Just go look up what a detailed heuristics eval looks like. You don't have to do every single point, but it'll help you illuminate the places that you intuitively know are wrong, and it'll help you check where you might be wrong too. But when you come back and have that conversation with the people, you'll be able to say, look, here are the heuristics from the Nielsen Norman group, and these people are super well respected in UX for a million reasons, and they've done all this research. And what they say is that this element has to be treated this way, or you're going to see these negative results, right? And you can kind of back it up with data without having to do user research. And so for me, that's kind of that's the approach I try to take. A lot of times I try to tell people, like, let's not spend money and talk to users. Let's try to do the foundational stuff, right? Like, I'll just use the most extreme example. If I have white text on a white background, I don't need to test that with users. I know what's wrong, right? You can't see the text. So it's the same kind of thing. It's just the examples are never as concrete as white text on a white background. So as long as you have those heuristics to look at, once they stop answering the questions, right? Once you get to this point where you're like, I don't know, I've looked at the heuristics and I'm not coming up with any way to know, then you probably need to talk to some users and see how it works.
Right. All right, Heidi here asks, what do you do if your goal has not been achieved? How do you evaluate the impact of your objectives?
Yeah, so the objectives are supposed to be super measurable. So let's just say one of my objectives was to increase, the add to cart by 50%, right? So either I did or I didn't do that, right? So if I did do that, and you can see that in analytics, but we still didn't reach the goal, right? Then that tells me that either my strategy needs to be modified or it's a bad strategy, right? Like if we executed every piece, every objective in a strategy was executed and it didn't move us towards our goal, it's time to look at that strategy and say, this probably isn't a winner, right? And either we need to, iterate on it to make it a winner potentially, or we need to just really chuck it and do something else. I mean, that's the most concrete answer I have, but in the real world, it doesn't always end up quite as clean as that, right? So let's just say my goal was to get to 50%, but I only got to 30%. And that was one objective. And I have 4 other objectives under the strategy, and each of them were like 70% met. Well, you could look at it and say, well, we didn't quite meet any of our objectives, so maybe this strategy is valid, right? And maybe we need to go back to the drawing board and see if there's anything obvious we left on the table. But if you've already iterated a couple times and you can't move those needles at that point, then it starts to become that conversation again around, I don't think we're going to execute on this as well as we need to move the needle. So let's look for an alternative approach. Whereas if you looked and you said, well, the dev team wasn't able to release this big thing that we wanted, and we had a mistake, like our design team recognizes that we made a mistake with something, and so these 30% gaps that we have, we might be able to fill them next quarter. Well, then stick with it. Just stick with that approach and keep grooving. But eventually you got to call it. Eventually you just have to say, we're not going to get there, and we need another approach to try to get there.
We have a couple more questions. So sure. Dave asks, when doing user research, how many users do you typically talk to?
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of depends on what I'm doing. Sometimes I play super fast and loose, and I do stuff with like 5 users if I feel pretty good about it based on heuristics and other things. But oftentimes it's up to like 20, 25. And one of the reasons why I end up going over what a lot of people recommend, right, is I'm typically working on projects now with much bigger budgets than when I was starting out. So there's money there. And B, like I said, I've yet to sit in a single user interview my entire career where I didn't learn something. And so I always think, let's just spend another, what is it, $150 on this participant and see if we learn something that's helpful in this case, right? There are restrictions on timer and everything. And so a lot of times I probably average out to about 10 or 15, but it's anywhere between 25 and 5, depending upon what I'm trying to solve.
Nice. And I think this might be our last question. What books do you recommend on the topic? Other than your own, of course.
Other than my own, of course. I'm a big fan of Cooper. So I guess, About Face is probably one of my favorites. And then if you went back further, The Inmates Are Running the Asylum is a really, really good one. That's one of his early books. It's a million years old, but it's painfully true still today. And so, those are ones that stick out to me. Mostly lately, I've been reading art books, not just UX books. Like there's a book called The Secret Lives of Color, which is just a great book all about all the different colors and like where they got used historically and how they get used and that kind of thing. Again, trying to always just broaden my knowledge versus, laser focusing on any one thing. I again should have a fantastic answer to this question, but I don't really have a good one because I'm going to get the title wrong. I'm trying to see if I can see it. No, so anything by Few. The author's last name is Few, and he does everything data visualization. So there's a ton of good data visualizations, and like right now, if I was talking to just young UX people, I would be saying, you cannot possibly go wrong learning everything possible about data visualization right now because the industry requires that at such a high level, right? So anything by Few, it's FEW. He has a couple different books out there. And data visualization just in general feels like a big thing to me. And then Measuring the UX, I think, is the title of the book. It's got dice on the cover. And that one is all about hardcore statistical analysis. And that's not me at all, right? I'm more of the small group, 5 to 25 type thing. But I think it's really good to understand the processes that people who do statistical analysis use. So it's a good book to kind of dive in the deep end and go way over your head and try to understand how like mega companies do massive research, just so you can use that to help leverage your own research. And then, gosh, there's another one. I wish I could see because I have like a whole bookshelf of books, but anyway, maybe if I put the link up, I'll try to find a place to put the book list too.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, we should do a big book club or something.
We should definitely.
Book sharing. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. I think that's the last of our questions and we're almost out of time, but thank you so much for being part of our community and coming here and talking to us about objectives and strategies and having these logical conversations with our team when we need to. Yeah. And thank you all, everyone, for coming out and joining us for this talk and presentation. And we hope to see you at the next one. I don't think we have anything on the calendar yet, but we'll be coming out with new stuff pretty soon, all in the works. So keep an eye out, and we hope to see you all pretty soon. So
thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.